This is a continuation of Red Nails by Robert E. Howard, comprising parts 4 and 5. Part 4. Scent of Black Lotus. Valeria unbuckled her sword belt and laid it with the sheathed weapon on the couch where she meant to sleep. She noted that the doors were supplied with bolts, and asked where they led. "Those lead into adjoining chambers," answered the woman, indicating the doors on right and left. "That one," pointing to a copper-bound door opposite that which opened into the corridor, "leads to a corridor which runs to a stair that descends into the catacombs. Do not fear. Naught can harm you here." "Who spoke of fear?" snapped Valeria. "I'd just like to know what sort of harbor I'm dropping anchor in. No, I don't want you to sleep at the foot of my couch. I'm not accustomed to being waited on, not by women anyway. You have my leave to go." Alone in the room, the pirate shot the bolts on all the doors, kicked off her boots and stretched luxuriously out on the couch. She imagined Conan similarly situated across the corridor, but her feminine vanity prompted her to visualize him as scowling and muttering with chagrin as he cast himself on his solitary couch, and she grinned with gleeful malice as she prepared herself for slumber. Outside, night had fallen. In the halls of Xuchotl, the green fire jewels blazed like the eyes of prehistoric cats. Somewhere among the dark towers, a night wind moaned like a restless spirit. Through the dim passages, stealthy figures began stealing, like disembodied shadows. Valeria awoke suddenly on her couch. In the dusky emerald glow of the fire gems, she saw a shadowy figure bending over her. For a bemused instant, the apparition seemed part of the dream she had been dreaming. She had seemed to lie on the couch in the chamber as she was actually lying, while over her pulsed and throbbed a gigantic black blossom, so enormous that it hid the ceiling. Its exotic perfume pervaded her being, inducing a delicious, sensuous languor that was something more and less than sleep. She was sinking into scented billows of insensible bliss when something touched her face. So supersensitive were her drugged senses that the light touch was like a dislocating impact, jolting her rudely into full wakefulness. Then it was that she saw, not a gargantuan blossom, but a dark-skinned woman standing above her. With the realization came anger and instant action. The woman turned lithely, but before she could run, Valeria was on her feet and had caught her arm. She fought like a wildcat for an instant, and then subsided as she felt herself crushed by the superior strength of her captor. The pirate wrenched the woman around to face her, caught her chin with her free hand and forced her captive to meet her gaze. It was the sullen Yasala, Tassela's maid. "What the devil were you doing bending over me? What's that in your hand?" The woman made no reply but sought to cast away the object. Valeria twisted her arm around in front of her, and the thing fell to the floor. A great black exotic blossom on a jade-green stem, large as a woman's head, to be sure, but tiny beside the exaggerated vision she had seen. "The Black Lotus," said Valeria between her teeth. "The blossom whose scent brings deep sleep. You were trying to drug me. If you hadn't accidentally touched my face with the petals, you'd have— Why did you do it? What's your game?" Yasala maintained a sulky silence, and with an oath Valeria whirled her around, forced her to her knees and twisted her arm up behind her back. "Tell me, or I'll tear your arm out of its socket." Yasala squirmed in anguish as her arm was forced excruciatingly up between her shoulder blades, but a violent shaking of her head was the only answer she made. "Slut!" Valeria cast her from her to sprawl on the floor. The pirate glared at the prostrate figure with blazing eyes. Fear and the memory of Tassela's burning eyes stirred in her, rousing all her tigerish instincts of self-preservation. These people were decadent. Any sort of perversity might be expected to be encountered among them. But Valeria sensed here something that moved behind the scenes, some secret terror fouler than common degeneracy. Fear and revulsion of this weird city swept her. These people were neither sane nor normal. She began to doubt if they were even human. Madness smoldered in the eyes of them all except the cruel, cryptic eyes of Tassela, which held secrets and mysteries more abysmal than madness. She lifted her head and listened intently. The halls of Xuchotl were as silent as if it were in reality a dead city. The green jewels bathed the chamber in a nightmare glow, in which the eyes of the woman on the floor glittered eerily up at her. A thrill of panic throbbed through Valeria, driving the last vestige of mercy from her fierce soul. "Why did you try to drug me?" she muttered, grasping the woman's black hair, and forcing her head back to glare into her sullen, long-lashed eyes. "Did Taskela send you?" No answer. Valeria cursed venomously and slapped the woman first on one cheek and then the other. The blows resounded through the room, but Yasala made no outcry. "Why don't you scream?" demanded Valeria savagely. "Do you fear someone will hear you? Whom do you fear? Tassela? Olmec? Conan?" Yasala made no reply. She crouched, watching her captor with eyes baleful as those of a basilisk. Stubborn silence always fans anger. Valeria turned and tore a handful of cords from a nearby hanging. "You sulky slut," she said between her teeth. "I'm going to strip you stark naked and tie you across that couch and whip you until you tell me what you were doing here and who sent you." Yasala made no verbal protest, nor did she offer any resistance, as Valeria carried out the first part of her threat with a fury that her captive's obstinacy only sharpened. Then for a space there was no sound in the chamber except the whistle and crackle of hard-woven silken cords on naked flesh. Yasala could not move her fast-bound hands or feet. Her body writhed and quivered under the chastisement. Her head swayed from side to side, in rhythm with the blows. Her teeth were sunk into her lower lip, and a trickle of blood began as the punishment continued. But she did not cry out. The pliant cords made no great sound as they encountered the quivering body of the captive, only a sharp crackling snap, but each cord left a red streak across Yasala's dark flesh. Valeria inflicted the punishment with all the strength of her war-hardened arm, with all the mercilessness acquired during a life where pain and torment were daily happenings, and with all the cynical ingenuity which only a woman displays toward a woman. Yasala suffered more, physically and mentally, than she would have suffered under a lash wielded by a man, however strong. It was the application of this feminine cynicism which at last tamed Yasala. A low whimper escaped from her lips, and Valeria paused, arm lifted, and raked back a damp yellow lock. "Well, are you going to talk?" she demanded. "I can keep this up all night if necessary." "Mercy," whispered the woman. "I will tell." Valeria cut the cords from her wrists and ankles and pulled her to her feet. Yasala sank down on the couch, half reclining on one bare hip, supporting herself on her arm, and writhing at the contact of her smarting flesh with the couch. She was trembling in every limb. "Wine!" she begged, dry-lipped, indicating with a quivering hand a gold vessel on an ivory table. "Let me drink. I am weak with pain. Then I will tell you all." Valeria picked up the vessel, and Yasala rose unsteadily to receive it. She took it, raised it toward her lips, then dashed the contents full into the Aquilonian's face. Valeria reeled backward, shaking and clawing the stinging liquid out of her eyes. Through a smarting mist, she saw Yasala dart across the room, fling back a bolt, throw open the copper-bound door, and run down the hall. The pirate was after her instantly, sword out and murder in her heart. But Yasala had the start, and she ran with the nervous agility of a woman who has just been whipped to the point of hysterical frenzy. She rounded a corner in the corridor, yards ahead of Valeria, and when the pirate turned it, she saw only an empty hall, and at the other end, a door that gaped blackly. A damp, moldy scent reeked up from it, and Valeria shivered. That must be the door that led to the catacombs. Yasala had taken refuge among the dead. Valeria advanced to the door and looked down a flight of stone steps that vanished quickly into utter blackness. Evidently it was a shaft that led straight to the pits below the city, without opening upon any of the lower floors. She shivered slightly at the thought of the thousands of corpses lying in their stone crypts down there, wrapped in their moldering cloths. She had no intention of groping her way down those stone steps. Yasala doubtless knew every turn and twist of the subterranean tunnels. She was turning back, baffled and furious, when a sobbing cry welled up from the blackness. It seemed to come from a great depth, but human words were faintly distinguishable, and the voice was that of a woman. "Oh, help! Help, in Set's name! Ah!" It trailed away, and Valeria thought she caught the echo of a ghostly tittering. Valeria felt her skin crawl. What had happened to Yasala down there in the thick blackness? There was no doubt that it had been she who had cried out. But what peril could have befallen her? Was a Xotalanca lurking down there? Olmec had assured them that the catacombs below Tekuhotli were walled off from the rest, too securely for their enemies to break through. Besides, that tittering had not sounded like a human being at all. Valeria hurried back down the corridor, not stopping to close the door that opened on the stair. Regaining her chamber, she closed the door and shot the bolt behind her. She pulled on her boots and buckled her sword belt about her. She was determined to make her way to Conan's room and urge him, if he still lived, to join her in an attempt to fight their way out of that city of devils. But even as she reached the door that opened into the corridor, a long-drawn scream of agony rang through the halls, followed by the stamp of running feet and the loud clangor of swords. Part 5. 20 Red Nails. 2 warriors lounged in the guardroom on the floor, known as the Tier of the Eagle. Their attitude was casual, though habitually alert. An attack on the great bronze door from without was always a possibility, but for many years no such assault had been attempted on either side. "The strangers are strong allies," said one. "Olmec will move against the enemy tomorrow, I believe." He spoke as a soldier in a war might have spoken. In the miniature world of Suchotl, each handful of feudists was an army, and the empty halls between the castles was the country over which they campaigned. The other meditated for a space. "Suppose with their aid we destroy Xotalanc," he said. "What then, Zatmek?" "Why," returned Zatmek, "we will drive red nails for them all. The captives we will burn and flay and quarter." "But afterward," pursued the other, "after we have slain them all, will it not seem strange to have no foes to fight? All my life I have fought and hated the Xotalancas. With the feud ended, what is left?" Zatmek shrugged his shoulders. His thoughts had never gone beyond the destruction of their foes. They could not go beyond that. Suddenly both men stiffened at a noise outside the door. "To the door, Zatmek," hissed the last speaker. "I shall look through the eye." Zatmek, sword in hand, leaned against the bronze door, straining his ear to hear through the metal. His mate looked into the mirror. He started convulsively. Men were clustered thickly outside the door. Grim, dark-faced men with swords gripped in their teeth, and their fingers thrust into their ears. One who wore a feathered headdress had a set of pipes which he set to his lips, and even as the Tekuhotli started to shout a warning, the pipes began to skirl. The cry died in the guard's throat as the thin, weird piping penetrated the metal door and smote on his ears. Zatmek leaned frozen against the door, as if paralyzed in that position. His face was that of a wooden image, his expression one of horrified listening. The other guard, farther removed from the source of the sound, yet sensed the horror of what was taking place, the grisly threat that lay in that demoniac fifing. He felt the weird strains plucking like unseen fingers at the tissues of his brain, filling him with alien emotions and impulses of madness. But with a soul-tearing effort, he broke the spell and shrieked a warning in a voice he did not recognize as his own. But even as he cried out, the music changed to an unbearable shrilling that was like a knife in the eardrums. Zatmek screamed in sudden agony, and all the sanity went out of his face like a flame blown out in a wind. Like a madman, he ripped loose the chain, tore open the door and rushed out into the hall, sword lifted before his mate could stop him. A dozen blades struck him down, and over his mangled body the Xotalanca surged into the guardroom, with a long-drawn, blood-mad yell that sent the unwanted echoes reverberating. His brain reeling from the shock of it all, the remaining guard leaped to meet them with goring spear. The horror of the sorcery he had just witnessed was submerged in the stunning realization that the enemy were in Tekuhotli. And as his spearhead ripped through a dark-skinned belly, he knew no more, for a swinging sword crushed his skull, even as wild-eyed warriors came pouring in from the chambers behind the guardroom. It was the yelling of men and the clanging of steel that brought Conan bounding from his couch, wide awake and broadsword in hand. In an instant he had reached the door and flung it open, and was glaring out into the corridor just as Tekuhotl rushed up it, eyes blazing madly. "The Xotalancas!" he screamed, in a voice hardly human. "They are within the door!" Conan ran down the corridor, even as Valeria emerged from her chamber. "What the devil is it?" she called. "Tekuhotl says the Xotalancas are in," he answered hurriedly. That racket sounds like it. With the Tecuhltli on their heels, they burst into the throne room and were confronted by a scene beyond the most frantic dream of blood and fury. 20 men and women, their black hair streaming, and the white skulls gleaming on their breasts, were locked in combat with the people of Tecuhltli. The women on both sides fought as madly as the men, and already the room and the hall beyond were strewn with corpses. Olmec, naked but for a breechclout, was fighting before his throne, and as the adventurers entered, Taskela ran from an inner chamber with a sword in her hand. Zatmek and his mate were dead, so there was none to tell the Tecuhltli how their foes had found their way into their citadel. Nor was there any to say what had prompted that mad attempt. But the losses of the Xotalancas had been greater, their position more desperate than the Tecuhltli had known. The maiming of their scaly ally, the destruction of the burning skull, and the news, gasped by a dying man, that mysterious white-skin allies had joined their enemies, had driven them to the frenzy of desperation and the wild determination to die dealing death to their ancient foes. The Tecuhltli, recovering from the first stunning shock of the surprise that had swept them back into the throne room and littered the floor with their corpses, fought back with an equally desperate fury, while the door guards from the lower floors came racing to hurl themselves into the fray. It was the death fight of rabid wolves, blind, panting, merciless. Back and forth it surged, from door to dais, blades whickering and striking into flesh, blood spurting, feet stamping the crimson floor where redder pools were forming. Ivory tables crashed over, seats were splintered, velvet hangings torn down were stained red. It was the bloody climax of a bloody half-century, and every man there sensed it. But the conclusion was inevitable. The Tecuhltli outnumbered the invaders almost 2-1, and they were heartened by that fact and by the entrance into the melee of their light-skinned allies. These crashed into the fray with the devastating effect of a hurricane plowing through a grove of saplings. In sheer strength, no 3 Tlazitlans were a match for Conan, and in spite of his weight he was quicker on his feet than any of them. He moved through the whirling, eddying mass with the surety and destructiveness of a gray wolf amidst a pack of alley curs, and he strode over a wake of crumpled figures. Valeria fought beside him, her lips smiling and her eyes blazing. She was stronger than the average man, and far quicker and more ferocious. Her sword was like a living thing in her hand. Where Conan beat down opposition by the sheer weight and power of his blows, breaking spears, splitting skulls, and cleaving bosoms to the breastbone, Valeria brought into action a finesse of swordplay that dazzled and bewildered her antagonists before it slew them. Again and again a warrior, heaving high his heavy blade, found her point in his jugular before he could strike. Conan, towering above the field, strode through the welter, smiting right and left, but Valeria moved like an elusive phantom, constantly shifting and thrusting and slashing as she shifted. Swords missed her again and again as the wielders flailed the empty air and died with her point in their hearts or throats and her mocking laughter in their ears. Neither sex nor condition was considered by the maddened combatants. The 5 women of the Xotalancas were down with their throats cut before Conan and Valeria entered the fray, and when a man or woman went down under the stamping feet, there was always a knife ready for the helpless throat, or a sandaled foot eager to crush the prostrate skull. From wall to wall, from door to door, rolled the waves of combat, spilling over into adjoining chambers. And presently only Tecuhltli and their white-skinned allies stood upright in the great throne room. The survivors stared bleakly and blankly at each other, like survivors after Judgment Day or the destruction of the world. On legs wide-braced, hands gripping notched and dripping swords, blood trickling down their arms, they stared at one another across the mangled corpses of friends and foes. They had no breath left to shout, but a bestial mad howling rose from their lips. It was not a human cry of triumph. It was the howling of a rabid wolf pack stalking among the bodies of its victims. Conan caught Valeria's arm and turned her about. "You've got a stab in the calf of your leg," he growled. She glanced down, for the first time aware of a stinging in the muscles of her leg. Some dying man on the floor had fleshed his dagger with his last effort. "You look like a butcher yourself," she laughed. He shook a red shower from his hands. "Not mine. Oh, a scratch here and there. Nothing to bother about. but that calf ought to be bandaged. Olmec came through the litter, looking like a ghoul with his naked massive shoulders splashed with blood, and his black beard dabbled in crimson. His eyes were red, like the reflection of flame on black water. "We have won," he croaked dazedly. "The feud is ended. The dogs of Xotalanc lie dead. Oh, for a captive to flay alive! Yet it is good to look upon their dead faces. 20 dead dogs. 20 red nails for the black column." "You'd best see to your wounded," grunted Conan, turning away from him. "Here, girl, let me see that leg." "Wait a minute." She shook him off impatiently. The fire of fighting still burned brightly in her soul. "How do we know these are all of them? These might have come on a raid of their own." "They would not split the clan on a foray like this," said Olmec, shaking his head and regaining some of his ordinary intelligence. Without his purple robe, the man seemed less like a prince than some repellent beast of prey. "I will stake my head upon it that we have slain them all. There were less of them than I dreamed, and they must have been desperate. But how came they in Tekuhotli?" Tassila came forward, wiping her sword on her naked thigh, and holding in her other hand an object she had taken from the body of the feathered leader of the Xotalancas. "The pipes of madness," she said. "A warrior tells me that Zatmek opened the door to the Xotalancas and was cut down as they stormed into the guardroom. This warrior came to the guardroom from the inner hall just in time to see it happen, and to hear the last of a weird strain of music which froze his very soul." Tolkemec used to talk of these pipes, which the Suchotlans swore were hidden somewhere in the catacombs, with the bones of the ancient wizard who used them in his lifetime. Somehow the dogs of Xotalanc found them and learned their secret. "Somebody ought to go to Xotalanc and see if any remain alive," said Conan. "I'll go if somebody will guide me." Olmec glanced at the remnants of his people. There were only 20 left alive, and of these several lay groaning on the floor. Tassila was the only one of the Tekuhotli who had escaped without a wound. The princess was untouched, though she had fought as savagely as any. "Who will go with Conan to Xotalanc?" asked Olmec. Techotl limped forward. The wound in his thigh had started bleeding afresh, and he had another gash across his ribs. "I will go." "No, you won't," vetoed Conan. "And you're not going either, Valeria. In a little while that leg will be getting stiff." "I will go," volunteered a warrior, who was knotting a bandage about a slashed forearm. "Very well, Yanath. Go with the Cimmerian, and you too, Topal." Olmec indicated another man whose injuries were slight. "But first aid us to lift the badly wounded on these couches where we may bandage their hurts." This was done quickly. As they stooped to pick up a woman who had been stunned by a war club, Olmec's beard brushed Topal's ear. Conan thought the prince muttered something to the warrior, but he could not be sure. A few moments later he was leading his companions down the hall. Conan glanced back as he went out the door, at that shambles where the dead lay on the smoldering floor. Blood-stained dark limbs knotted in attitudes of fierce muscular effort, dark faces frozen in masks of hate, glassy eyes glaring up at the green fire jewels which bathed the ghastly scene in a dusky emerald witch light. Among the dead the living moved aimlessly, like people moving in a trance. Conan heard Olmec call a woman and direct her to bandage Valeria's leg. The pirate followed the woman into an adjoining chamber, already beginning to limp slightly. Warily the two Tekuhotli led Conan along the hall beyond the bronze door, and through chamber after chamber shimmering in the green fire. They saw no one, heard no sound. After they crossed the great hall which bisected the city from north to south, their caution was increased by the realization of their nearness to enemy territory. But chambers and halls lay empty to their wary gaze, and they came at last along a broad, dim hallway and halted before a bronze door similar to the eagle door of Tekuhotli. Gingerly they tried it, and it opened silently under their fingers. Awed, they stared into the green-lit chambers beyond. For 50 years no Tekuhotli had entered those halls save as a prisoner going to a hideous doom. To go to Xotalanc had been the ultimate horror that could befall a man of the western castle. The terror of it had stalked through their dreams since earliest childhood. To Yanath and Topal, that bronze door was like the portal of hell. They cringed back, unreasoning horror in their eyes, and Conan pushed past them and strode into Xotalanc. Timidly they followed him. As each man set foot over the threshold, he stared and glared wildly about him. But only their quick, hurried breathing disturbed the silence. They had come into a square guardroom, like that behind the eagle door of Tekuhultli, and, similarly, a hall ran away from it to a broad chamber that was a counterpart of Olmec's throne room. Conan glanced down the hall with its rugs and divans and hangings, and stood listening intently. He heard no noise, and the rooms had an empty feel. He did not believe there were any Xotalankas left alive in Xuchotl. "Come on," he muttered, and started down the hall. He had not gone far when he was aware that only Yanath was following him. He wheeled back to see Topal standing in an attitude of horror, one arm out as if to fend off some threatening peril, his distended eyes fixed with hypnotic intensity on something protruding from behind a divan. What the devil? Then Conan saw what Topal was staring at, and he felt a faint twitching of the skin between his giant shoulders. A monstrous head protruded from behind the divan, a reptilian head, broad as the head of a crocodile, with down-curving fangs that projected over the lower jaw. But there was an unnatural limpness about the thing, and the hideous eyes were glazed. Conan peered behind the couch. It was a great serpent which lay there limp in death, but such a serpent as he had never seen in his wanderings. The reek and chill of the deep black earth were about it, and its color was an indeterminable hue which changed with each new angle from which he surveyed it. A great wound in the neck showed what had caused its death. "It is the crawler," whispered Yanath. "It's the thing I slashed on the stair," grunted Conan. "After it trailed us to the eagle door, it dragged itself here to die. How could the Xotalankas control such a brute?" The Tekuhotli shivered and shook their heads. "They brought it up from the black tunnels below the catacombs. They discovered secrets unknown to Tekuhotli. Well, it's dead, and if they'd had any more of them, they'd have brought them along when they came to Tekuhotli. Come on." They crowded close at his heels as he strode down the hall and thrust on the silver-worked door at the other end. "If we don't find anybody on this floor," he said, "we'll descend into the lower floors. We'll explore Xotalank from the roof to the catacombs. If Xotalank is like Tekuhotli, all the rooms and halls in this tier will be lighted. What the devil?" They had come into the broad throne chamber, so similar to that one in Tekultli. There were the same jade dais and ivory seat, the same divans, rugs, and hangings on the walls. No black, red-scarred column stood behind the throne dais, but evidences of the grim feud were not lacking. Ranged along the wall behind the dais were rows of glass-covered shelves, and on those shelves hundreds of human heads, perfectly preserved, stared at the startled watchers with emotionless eyes, as they had stared for only the gods knew how many months and years. Topal muttered a curse, but Yanath stood silent, the mad light growing in his wide eyes. Conan frowned, knowing that Tlazitlan's sanity was hung on a hair-trigger. Suddenly Yanath pointed to the ghastly relics with a twitching finger. "There is my brother's head," he murmured, "and there is my father's younger brother, and there beyond them is my sister's eldest son." Suddenly he began to weep, dry-eyed, with harsh, loud sobs that shook his frame. He did not take his eyes from the heads. His sobs grew shriller, changed to frightful, high-pitched laughter, and that in turn became an unbearable screaming. Yanath was stark mad. Conan laid a hand on his shoulder, and as if the touch had released all the frenzy in his soul, Yanath screamed and whirled, striking at the Cimmerian with his sword. Conan parried the blow, and Topal tried to catch Yanath's arm. But the madman avoided him, and with froth flying from his lips, he drove his sword deep into Topal's body. Topal sank down with a groan, and Yanath whirled for an instant like a crazy dervish. Then he ran at the shelves and began hacking at the glass with his sword, screeching blasphemously. Conan sprang at him from behind, trying to catch him unaware and disarm him, but the madman wheeled and lunged at him, screaming like a lost soul. Realizing that the warrior was hopelessly insane, the Cimmerian sidestepped, and as the maniac went past, he swung a cut that severed the shoulder bone and breast, and dropped the man dead beside his dying victim. Conan bent over Topal, seeing that the man was at his last gasp. It was useless to seek to stanch the blood gushing from the horrible wound. "You're done for, Topal," grunted Conan. "Any word you want to send to your people?" "Bend closer," gasped Topal, and Conan complied, and an instant later caught the man's wrist as Topal struck at his breast with a dagger. "Chrome," swore Conan. "Are you mad too?" "Olmec ordered it," gasped the dying man. "I know not why. As we lifted the wounded upon the couches, he whispered to me, bidding me to slay you as we returned to Tecuhltli." And with the name of his clan on his lips, Topal died. Conan scowled down at him in puzzlement. This whole affair had an aspect of lunacy. Was Olmec mad too? Were all the Tecuhltli madder than he had realized? With a shrug of his shoulders, he strode down the hall and out of the bronze door, leaving the dead Tecuhltli lying before the staring dead eyes of their kinsmen's heads. Conan needed no guide back through the labyrinth they had traversed. His primitive instinct of direction led him unerringly along the route they had come. He traversed it as warily as he had before, his sword in his hand, and his eyes fiercely searching each shadowed nook and corner. For it was his former allies he feared now, not the ghosts of the slain Xotalankas. He had crossed the great hall and entered the chambers beyond, when he heard something moving ahead of him, something which gasped and panted, and moved with a strange, floundering, scrambling noise. A moment later, Conan saw a man crawling over the flaming floor toward him, a man whose progress left a broad, bloody smear on the smoldering surface. It was Techotl, and his eyes were already glazing. From a deep gash in his breast, blood gushed steadily between the fingers of his clutching hand. With the other, he clawed and hitched himself along. "Conan!" he cried chokingly. "Conan! Olmec has taken the yellow-haired woman." "So that's why he told Topal to kill me," murmured Conan, dropping to his knee beside the man, who his experienced eye told him was dying. "Olmec isn't so mad as I thought." Techotl's groping fingers plucked at Conan's arm. In the cold, loveless, and altogether hideous life of the Tecuhltli, his admiration and affection for the invaders from the outer world formed a warm, human oasis, constituted a tie that connected him with a more natural humanity that was totally lacking in his fellows, whose only emotions were hate, lust, and the urge of sadistic cruelty. "I sought to oppose him," gurgled Techotl, blood bubbling frothily to his lips. "But he struck me down. He thought he had slain me, but I crawled away. Ah, Set, how far I have crawled in my own blood. Beware, Conan. Olmec may have set an ambush for your return. Slay Olmec. He is a beast. Take Valeria and flee. Fear not to traverse the forest. Olmec and Tassila lied about the dragons. They slew each other years ago, all save the strongest. For a dozen years there has been only one dragon. If you have slain him, there is naught in the forest to harm you. He was the god Olmec worshipped, and Olmec fed human sacrifices to him, the very old and the very young, bound and hurled from the wall. Hasten! Olmec has taken Valeria to the chamber of the—" His head slumped down, and he was dead before it came to rest on the floor. Conan sprang up, his eyes like live coals. So that was Olmec's game, having first used the strangers to destroy his foes. He should have known that something of the sort would be going on in that black-bearded degenerate's mind. The Cimmerian started toward Tecuhltli with reckless speed. Rapidly he reckoned the numbers of his former allies. Only 21, counting Olmec, had survived that fiendish battle in the throne room. 3 had died since, which left 17 enemies with which to reckon. In his rage, Conan felt capable of accounting for the whole clan single-handed. But the innate craft of the wilderness rose to guide his berserk rage. He remembered Techotl's warning of an ambush. It was quite probable that the prince would make such provisions, on the chance that Topal might have failed to carry out his order. Olmec would be expecting him to return by the same route he had followed in going to Xotalanc. Conan glanced up at a skylight under which he was passing, and caught the blurred glimmer of stars. They had not yet begun to pale for dawn. The events of the night had been crowded into a comparatively short space of time. He turned aside from his direct course and descended a winding staircase to the floor below. He did not know where the door was to be found that led into the castle on that level, but he knew he could find it. How he was to force the locks he did not know. He believed that the doors of Tecuhltli would all be locked and bolted, if for no other reason than the habits of half a century. But there was nothing else but to attempt it, Sword in hand, he hurried noiselessly on through a maze of green-lit or shadowy rooms and halls. He knew he must be near Tecuhltli when a sound brought him up short. He recognized it for what it was, a human being trying to cry out through a stifling gag. It came from somewhere ahead of him, and to the left. In those deathly still chambers, a small sound carried a long way. Conan turned aside and went seeking after the sound, which continued to be repeated. Presently he was glaring through a doorway upon a weird scene. In the room into which he was looking, a low, rack-like frame of iron lay on the floor, and a giant figure was bound prostrate upon it. His head rested on a bed of iron spikes, which were already crimson-pointed with blood where they had pierced his scalp. A peculiar harness-like contrivance was fastened about his head, though in such a manner that the leather band did not protect his scalp from the spikes. This harness was connected by a slender chain to the mechanism that upheld a huge iron ball, which was suspended above the captive's hairy breast. As long as the man could force himself to remain motionless, the iron ball hung in its place. But when the pain of the iron points caused him to lift his head, the ball lurched downward a few inches. Presently his aching neck muscles would no longer support his head in its unnatural position, and it would fall back on the spikes again. It was obvious that eventually the ball would crush him to a pulp, slowly and inexorably. The victim was gagged, and above the gag his great black ox eyes rolled wildly toward the man in the doorway, who stood in silent amazement. The man on the rack was Olmec, Prince of Tecuhltli. This concludes the fourth part of 5 total of Red Nails, by Robert E. Howard, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.